The first thing I saw that morning was a black Cadillac sitting crooked across the loading lane behind my dairy barn, shiny enough to catch the sunrise and ugly enough to make my stomach turn. The second thing I saw was Grant Hollis leaning against the hood with a paper cup of coffee in one hand, smiling like he had finally found the one place in Hawthorne County where I could not get away from him. The third thing I heard was 32 Holstein cows calling from inside the barn, not loudly, not dramatically, just the low, restless sound animals make when they know the day is late and something is wrong. It was April of 1995, and I was 49 years old, tired in the bones the way you get after a lifetime of getting up before the sun. And I remember standing there in my old work boots with one hand on the barn door, staring at that Cadillac like it had landed from another planet. It was a DeVille, black paint, tan leather, chrome everywhere, the kind of car that looked like it belonged outside a country club, not parked in a muddy dairy lane with manure on one side and a rusted milk can on the other. Grant knew exactly what he was doing. He did not park there by accident, not with that much room along the county road, not when every person in town knew that lane was the only way my tractor could get from the equipment shed to the feed barn. He had parked there because he wanted me stuck. He wanted my morning disrupted, my milk delivery delayed, my cows fed late, and most of all, he wanted to watch me lose my temper. Grant Hollis had been waiting for that for nearly 3 years. My name is Evelyn Rudd, though most people in town called me Evie. And back then I owned 41 acres on the edge of Ash Creek, Missouri. Land my father bought in 1958 when the road was still gravel and folks still left pies on each other's porches after funerals. My father built that barn with his brothers, one beam at a time, and when he died, he left it to me, not because I was the oldest, not because I was the strongest, but because I was the one who stayed. I had stayed through the drought of 1980, through the flood of 1986, through the year my husband Ray died in a grain elevator accident, and I had to learn how to keep a dairy running with one less pair of hands and a heart that felt like somebody had broken it clean in half. I stayed when my daughter left for nursing school in Springfield, when people told me it was too much land for one woman, when banks sent polite little letters suggesting I might be happier selling while prices were good. I stayed because the land was mine, and more than that, because I belonged to it. Then came Willow Trace Estates. That was Grant Hollis's grand idea. He took 80 acres of pasture behind my place, built 26 big, pale houses with fake brick fronts and decorative shutters, named the streets after trees that had never grown there, and formed the Willow Trace Homeowners Association before the paint was dry on the first garage door. At first I tried to be neighborly. I brought a pound cake to the family that moved in closest to my south fence. I let their kids come see the calves. I even helped one young couple pull their minivan out of a ditch after a heavy rain. But Grant did not want neighborly. Grant wanted order. He wanted clean lines, matching mailboxes, quiet mornings, and a view that made his development brochure look expensive. The problem was, my dairy did not fit on a brochure. It smelled like cows after rain, it sounded like machinery before daylight, and it had a weathered red barn that had been standing since Harry Truman was president. Grant saw all of that and decided I was a problem he could solve. The complaints started small. The cows were too noisy. The barn light stayed on too late. My hired hand played country radio while he repaired fences. My delivery truck left tire marks near the edge of the access road. Then one afternoon, Grant stood at my kitchen table with a clipboard and told me the old white fence along my pasture line made the neighborhood look neglected. I remember looking at him, then looking out the window at that fence which my father and I had painted together the summer before he died. I said, "Grant, that fence is older than your entire subdivision." He smiled at me, thin and polite, like a man trying not to laugh at a child. He said, "Evie, things change. Communities grow. People expect standards." I said people also expect milk in their refrigerator, but apparently we were not putting that on the list. He did not laugh. Grant never laughed unless he thought somebody else was losing. By the spring of 1995, the truth had become obvious. Grant did not just want me to clean up the farm. He wanted me gone. He had plans for Willow Trace Phase 2, a larger section of homes with bigger lots and a new entrance road, and the easiest way to build it was through my land. He had made me offers through a lawyer, then through a banker, then through his secretary, who showed up with a folder and a smile so nervous I almost felt sorry for her. I turned them all down. Everyone. Then the tone changed. The notices began. A handwritten warning about livestock odor. A letter complaining about early tractor noise, a petition from a few of the newer residents claiming the dairy lowered property values. One family even complained that my rooster woke their baby at dawn, which struck me as funny because I had not owned a rooster in 6 years. That was Grant's style. He did not need facts. He just needed enough paper to make people doubt themselves. And that morning, with his Cadillac blocking my loading lane, he finally stopped pretending it was about rules. He pushed his sunglasses up on his head and said, "Morning, Evie." I said, "Move the car." He took a slow sip of coffee. He said, "You always start the day this friendly." I said, "Grant, my cows are waiting to be fed. The milk truck is due in an hour, and your Cadillac is blocking the only lane I have. Move it." He looked over his shoulder at the barn and then back at me. "Well," he said, "maybe your cows can wait." I stared at him. He smiled again. "I had contractors at my place," he said. "My driveway is torn up. I needed somewhere safe to park." I said, "There are 50 acres of open space around here, Grant." He shrugged. This was convenient. That word got under my skin. Convenient. Like my whole life was just an inconvenience to him. Like the barn my father built, the cows I had raised, the land I had paid taxes on for 30 years, all of it was just clutter in the way of his little kingdom. I said, "You have 5 minutes." He looked at his watch. "No," he said, "I think you can wait." Then he leaned closer, lowered his voice, and said, "Maybe it is time you learned that you cannot keep running this place forever." I'd heard him say cruel things before, but there was something different in the way he said that. It was quiet, certain, like he was not making a threat, he was describing a plan. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of him. I wanted to throw his coffee in the gravel. I wanted to take the keys out of that Cadillac and toss them into the manure pit. Instead, I stood there, breathing through my nose, because I knew Grant had brought an audience. 2 women from Willow Trace were standing near the fence line pretending to look at tulips. A teenage boy from the new houses had his camcorder pointed in our direction. This was not a parking problem. This was bait. Grant wanted me angry, loud, reckless, something he could carry into the next HOA meeting and hold up like proof that I was unstable. So I looked him dead in the face and said, "Fine, enjoy your coffee." Then I walked away. Behind me, I heard him laugh, soft and smug, and I swear it sounded like a screen door slamming in an empty house. I went into the feed room, measured grain, checked water lines, did everything I could do without the tractor. But my mind would not settle. I kept seeing that Cadillac sitting there, black and polished in the middle of my working farm, like Grant had planted a flag on my property. By 6:15, the cows were growing louder. By 6:30, the milk truck driver, a good man named Clyde Martin, came down the lane in his white tanker truck and stopped behind the Cadillac. Clyde leaned out the window, saw Grant, saw me, saw the car, and just rubbed one hand over his face. He said, "Evie, please tell me this fool is not blocking your loading lane." Grant said, "It is a private matter." Clyde looked at him and said, "Son, milk is private until it spoils, then it is everybody's problem." Grant told him to mind his own business. Clyde did not argue. He just looked at me and said, "You want me to call the sheriff?" I said I already planned to. I went inside, picked up the beige wall phone in my kitchen, and called the Hawthorne County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Cal Hurst answered. Cal had gone to high school with my younger brother and had a decent head on his shoulders, but when I explained the situation, he got quiet for a second, in the way people do when they know something is wrong but are not yet sure how much trouble they are willing to step into. He said, "Evie, I can come out and take a report, but if it is a property dispute, it may end up civil." I said, "Cal, he is not parked on a road. He is parked in front of my barn. He is blocking farm access. He said he would come by." Grant heard me on the phone and smiled like he had won something. He said, "You really think Cal is going to side with you?" I said, "I do not know who he will side with, but I know he will see you, and seeing you clearly has a way of changing people's minds." Part 2. The middle. Deputy Hurst arrived 20 minutes later in his cruiser, one hand resting on the door as he looked over the whole scene. Grant started talking before Cal had both feet on the ground. "You said he was temporarily parked there while contractors repaired his driveway, that I had become hostile, that I was overreacting, though I was trying to intimidate him because he represented the HOA. Cal listened without interrupting, which was probably the best thing he could have done because Grant kept talking until he sounded foolish all by himself. Then Cal turned to me. I told him about the blocked lane, the milk truck, the feed schedule, the tractor locked in the shed, and the fact that this was not the first time Grant had tried to interfere with my business. Cal walked over to the Cadillac, crouched beside the front tire, then looked toward the barn. He paced the distance himself. When he came back, he said, "This lane is the only equipment access?" I said, "Yes." He looked at Grant. Grant said, "She has other land." I said, "I have other land, not another lane. There is a difference." Cal scratched the side of his jaw and said, "Mr. Hollis, I suggest you move the vehicle." Grant folded his arms. "Suggest," he said. Cal said, "That is what I am doing right now." Grant looked at me, then at Cal, and said, "I am not moving it until my driveway is clear. This is a civil matter." Cal did not raise his voice. He said, "It may become more than that if you are interfering with a working agricultural operation." Grant gave a short laugh. "Agricultural operation? She has a handful of cows in an old barn." Cal looked at him for a long moment and said, "You ever milked a cow, Mr. Hollis?" Grant blinked. Cal said, "Then do not tell me what counts as an operation." For about half a second, I thought that might be the end of it. I thought Grant would get embarrassed, climb into his Cadillac, back up, and drive away. But he was too proud for that. He said, "I have a lawyer." Cal said, "Good. Tell him I recommend you call him before this gets worse." Then Cal turned to me and said he needed to check county property maps and easement records before he could take stronger action. He told Grant he was documenting the obstruction and warned him that keeping the car there could create real problems. Grant waved him off like he was swatting a fly. That was the thing about Grant. He had spent too many years being listened to in boardrooms, too many years being called sir by people who wanted loans approved, too many years thinking a firm voice and a clean suit made him smarter than everyone else. He did not understand that the rest of us were not impressed by a man just because he owned expensive things. After Cal left, Grant sat back against the Cadillac and made a show of opening the newspaper. The Kansas City Star, folded neatly in his hands like he was on a Sunday porch. He had blocked my farm, delayed my milk truck, thrown off my whole morning, and now he was reading the paper. I went about my work as best I could. Clyde had to leave without collecting the milk because the tanker could not get close enough to the cooling room. I called the dairy co-op and explained what happened. The woman on the line, Marcia, said she could send another truck later, but not until the afternoon. That meant I had to keep the tank cold and hope the milk held. My hired hand, a 23-year-old kid named Mason who had more heart than sense, came in around 7 and saw the Cadillac. He said, "Mrs. Rudd, do you want me to move it?" I said, "With what?" He looked at the tractor shed. I looked at him. Then I said, "Mason, go fix the south fence." He grinned because he knew exactly what I meant. The rest of the day crawled by. Grant sat there for a while, then drove away in a friend's pickup, leaving the Cadillac behind like a paperweight. That made me angrier than if he had stayed. He had abandoned the car there because he knew it was doing its job without him. By noon, people from Willow Trace had started coming down the road to look. Some were curious, some were nervous, some pretended they were just out walking, which is how you know they were definitely there to watch trouble. My neighbor, Rita Bell, drove up in her old red Buick with 2 bags of groceries in the passenger seat. Rita ran the diner in Ash Creek and had known me since we were 16. She rolled down her window and said, "Evie, why is there a funeral home car in your barn lane?" I said, "Because Grant Hollis is trying to bury me." She parked, got out, looked over the Cadillac and said, "Well, he picked the right color for it." Rita was never afraid of saying what everybody else was thinking. She stood with me by the fence for a while, watching people gather. Then she said, "You know what this is about, don't you?" I said, "I know." She said, "He wants your land." I nodded. She said, "Then do not fight him about a car. Fight him about the land." That sentence sat with me. It was simple, but it was true. All day I had been thinking about the Cadillac, the insult of it, the inconvenience, the way it made my farm look small beside his money. But Rita was right. The Cadillac was only the mask. The real fight was underneath it. That evening, I went to the Willow Trace HOA meeting. The clubhouse had beige carpet, fake ivy in plastic pots, and a coffee maker that smelled like burned pennies. Grant was sitting at the center of a folding table with 3 board members beside him, all of them holding folders, all of them pretending this was just ordinary community business. The room was full. Word travels fast in a town like Ash Creek, and people knew there was going to be a show. I stood up when they called my name and explained everything. I told him the Cadillac was blocking a dairy lane, that the milk truck had been turned away, that the tractor could not reach the feed barn, and that Grant had ignored the deputy's request to move the car. Grant leaned back in his chair, calm as a man at a golf course. He said, "Evelyn is exaggerating. I parked temporarily. Her farm was not shut down." I said my milk truck could not get to my cooling room. He said, "It could come later." I said, "Cows do not run on your meeting schedule, Grant." One of the board members, a woman named Marlene, who had once sent me a complaint about my clothesline, said, "Perhaps it would help if you were more flexible, Evelyn." I looked at her and said, "You mean flexible enough to let people park on my farm whenever they feel like it?" She looked down at her notes. Grant said, "This is exactly the problem. You see every inconvenience as a personal attack." I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because sometimes the truth is so crooked you do not know what else to do. I said, "You parked a luxury car across the only working lane to a dairy barn, Grant. If that is not personal, then you have a very strange definition of friendship." He leaned forward then, and the smile disappeared. He said, "Maybe the real issue is that this farm no longer belongs in the middle of a growing community." The room got quiet. He continued, "People invest in this area. They raise families. They expect property values to be protected. You cannot keep holding the whole county hostage to an outdated way of life." There it was. Not a complaint about a car. Not a complaint about noise. The truth. He wanted me to sell. He wanted me to disappear so he could build another row of neat little houses with little white fences that nobody would ever lean on, because nobody would ever actually need a fence. I looked at him and said, "This farm was here before your entrance sign, before your clubhouse, before your ugly little flower beds, before you ever learned where Ash Creek was on a map, and it will be here after you were gone." A few people clapped. Not many, but enough. Grant's face tightened. The board table whispered among themselves, then announced that they would review the matter. That was their favorite phrase, review the matter. It meant do nothing and hope the person with less money gave up first. I drove home that night under a hard, clear sky, hands tight on the steering wheel, thinking about Ray. He'd been dead 8 years by then, but when I was scared or angry, I still talked to him in my head. Ray would have hated Grant. Not because Grant was rich, but because Grant thought being rich gave him permission to be cruel. Ray had a saying. He used to say, "You can tell what kind of person a man is by how he treats something he cannot buy." I pulled into the driveway, saw that Cadillac still parked in front of my barn, and knew Grant had shown me exactly what kind of man he was. The next morning, I did not go to the barn first. I drove to the Hawthorne County Courthouse. It was an old brick building with a clock that never kept good time and a records office that smelled like dust, paper, and floor wax. I found Amos Greeley there sitting by the deed books with a pair of reading glasses low on his nose. Amos had been the county surveyor before he retired, and he knew every odd line, ditch, easement, and property dispute in 3 counties. I told him what had happened. He did not look surprised. He said, "Grant Hollis thinks paper only matters when he is holding it." Then he pulled out a thick map folder and started turning pages. We spent nearly 2 hours looking through old plats, county records, and survey notes. Finally, Amos tapped one yellow document with his finger. It was dated 1962, before Willow Trace was even a field of weeds. It showed my dairy lane, not as a private driveway, but as an agricultural service access recorded with the county. The lane had been reserved for farm machinery, milk trucks, emergency vehicles, and livestock transport. It ran through the edge of what was now Grant's development, and the county had never released the easement. Amos looked at me over his glasses and said, "Evie, that man did not just block your barn. He blocked a county agricultural access lane." I stared at the paper so long the lines blurred. It was not revenge I felt in that moment. It was relief, the kind that comes when you've been standing in a dark room and somebody finally finds the light switch. I took copies of everything and drove straight to Deputy Hurst. He read the records twice, then called the county attorney. I sat in a metal chair outside his office while he made phone calls. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly, but from the exhaustion of being forced to fight for something that should never have been questioned. After nearly an hour, Cal came out holding the paperwork. He said, "I cannot tell you what will happen with any civil claim later, but I can tell you this. Grant Hollis does not have the right to obstruct that lane." I said, "So what happens now?" Carl looked out the window toward the parking lot and said, "Now we give him one more chance to move that Cadillac." Part 3. The ending. By the time we got back to the farm, Word had spread faster than a storm warning. There were trucks parked along the road, people standing by the fence, kids on bicycles, even a couple of older men from the feed store who had clearly come out just to see whether Grant Hollis would finally be told no. The Cadillac was still there, shining in the afternoon light, looking expensive and ridiculous in a place where every other vehicle had mud on it. Grant was standing by the barn when we arrived, talking to a lawyer in a grey suit who looked uncomfortable the second he stepped out of his Lincoln Town car and saw the crowd. Cal walked up first. He handed Grant the easement records and said, "Mr. Hollis, this vehicle is blocking a recorded agricultural access lane. I am ordering you to move it immediately." Grant looked at the papers, then at me, then at Cal. He said, "This is absurd. That is her private farm." Cal said, "It is her farm, yes. It is also a protected agricultural access route." Grant said, "I will call my attorney." The lawyer beside him cleared his throat and said, "Grant, perhaps you should just move the vehicle." Grant turned on him. "I am not being pushed around by her." I had been standing near the barn door, quiet until then. I said, "Nobody is pushing you around, Grant. That is the whole point. You parked there because you thought nobody could stop you." He looked at me with that same hard little smile, but it had cracks in it now. He said, "You think one old piece of paper changes anything?" I said, "No, I think it proves something you forgot. This place has rules too. They just were not written by you." For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The wind moved through the pasture. One of my cows kicked the inside of the barn wall. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked. Then Grant did something I did not expect. He got into the Cadillac, turned the key, and tried to back out. The rear tires spun immediately. We had gotten rain the night before, and the shoulder beside the lane was soft clay. In all his confidence, Grant had parked just far enough off the packed gravel that his back wheels had sunk into the mud. He shifted forward, then backward, then forward again. The tires sprayed wet dirt against the side of the car. The crowd got quieter. You could hear that engine whining, hear him pressing harder, hear the whole expensive machine losing an argument with Missouri soil. His lawyer walked over and said something through the window. Grant ignored him. He hit the gas again. The Cadillac slid sideways deeper into the shoulder, its rear end dropping low enough that the chrome bumper nearly touched the dirt. That was when Rita Bell, standing by the fence with her arms crossed, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, would you look at that? Guess the land has standards too." A few people laughed. Grant heard them. You could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened. He climbed out of the car, face red, shirt collar damp with sweat. He pointed at me and said, "You planned this." I could not help it. I said, "Grant, I have been here since 1968. I did not plan mud." "You did." Deputy Hurst told him he had 10 minutes to arrange removal of the car, or the county would call a wrecker. Grant threatened lawsuits, complaints, headlines, every weapon he had ever used to scare people into stepping back. Nobody moved. His lawyer finally put a hand on his arm and said, "Grant, please stop talking." But Grant was too far gone. He looked at the crowd, at the board members from Willow Trace who had come to watch, at the neighbor families who had spent years listening to him lecture them about rules, and he realized something terrible. The people around him were no longer afraid. That was the moment he lost more than the argument. He lost the room. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later, an old blue heavy wrecker from Miller's garage, driven by a quiet man named Hank Miller, who had pulled half the county out of ditches at one time or another. Hank took one look at the Cadillac half buried in the clay and said, "Son, you picked a fancy place to get stuck." Grant snapped at him not to touch the car. Cal stepped between them and said, "Mr. Rust, Hollis, you were ordered to clear the agricultural lane. You refused. The vehicle is being removed." Grant looked at me then, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not look smug. He looked frightened. Not frightened of me, exactly. Frightened of the fact that his money, his title, his association, his clean black Cadillac, none of it had protected him from the simple truth that he had gone too far. Hank hooked the wrecker cable under the rear axle, tightened the line, and eased the Cadillac out of the mud, inch by inch. The tires turned slowly, flinging clumps of red clay. The chrome was streaked brown. The perfect paint had a long scratch along the passenger side from a buried fence post. Nobody cheered. That is something I remember clearly. Nobody cheered because it was not funny anymore. It was just a man being forced to face the consequences of a thing he had done on purpose. Grant stood there watching his Cadillac get pulled free, and I stood beside the barn door watching him. After a while he said, "This is not over." I believed him. People like Grant never think anything is over as long as they still have breath in their lungs and a lawyer willing to take their call. But I said, "No, Grant, it is over. You just do not know it yet." He climbed into the tow truck with Hank, because the Cadillac had to be taken to the garage for inspection, and as they drove away, the crowd slowly began to break apart. A few neighbors came over to shake my hand. Clyde from the dairy co-op said he would send a truck right away. Mason came running from the south fence, looked at the clear lane, then looked at me and said, "Mrs. Rudd, you want me to get the tractor?" I looked at the barn, at the open path, at the sun dropping behind the trees. I said, "Yes, Mason. Let's get to work." The tractor started on the first try, which felt like a small miracle. I drove it out of the shed myself, slow and steady, past the place where Grant's Cadillac had been sitting. The lane was muddy, scarred, ugly, but it was open. That was all I needed. The real ending came 3 weeks later at the Willow Trace board meeting. Grant showed up with a stack of papers and a face like a thundercloud. He wanted me fined, sued, censured, publicly condemned, anything he could think of. But the mood had changed. People who had stayed quiet for years began standing up one by one. A retired schoolteacher talked about how Grant had threatened her over a bird feeder. A young father said Grant had tried to fine his son for riding a dirt bike on their own property. A widow named Lorraine said Grant had pressured her to sell when her husband died because he wanted her corner lot for a clubhouse expansion. Then Amos Greeley stood up with the easement map in his hands and explained exactly what Grant had done by blocking my farm lane. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, the room was silent. The board voted that night to remove Grant as president of the association. It was not unanimous. Nothing worth remembering ever is, but it passed. Grant left before the meeting ended. He did not slam the door. He did not make a speech. He just walked out carrying his folder, shoulders stiff like a man leaving a place he believed belonged to him. After that, life got quieter. Not perfect, because life on a farm is never perfect. Cows still get sick. Fences still break. Rain still comes too late or too hard. But the notices stopped. The complaints slowed down. People started waving again when they drove past the farm. A few families from Willow Trace began bringing their kids over on Saturdays to see the calves. One little boy asked me why the lane had a new sign that said agricultural access, no parking. I told him because sometimes people need signs to remind them that the world did not begin when they arrived. He nodded like he understood, then asked if he could pet a cow. That was the thing about children. They always knew what mattered. Years later, I still think about that morning. I think about Grant's Cadillac in the mud, about the way I wanted to scream, about how close I came to letting anger make every decision for me. And I will be honest, there are still people in Ash Creek who say I embarrassed him too much. Some say I should have let him save face, handled it quietly, made peace for the good of the community. Maybe they are right. Maybe I could have been softer. Maybe I could have found a way to protect my farm without making Grant Hollis stand in front of half the county and watch his Cadillac get dragged out of the dirt. But then I think about every warning letter, every threat, every time he tried to make me feel small on my own land. And I think about the sound of those cows calling from the barn while he stood outside drinking coffee. That was not a misunderstanding. That was not a neighborly disagreement. That was a man testing how much he could take before I finally said no. So I want to ask you this. What would you have done in my place? Would you have had the Cadillac towed after the first warning, or would you have tried harder to keep the peace? Was I standing up for my farm, or did I make an example out of a man who deserved a quieter way out? Tell me what you think in the comments, because after all these years, I still believe the hardest question is never who was right. The hardest question is how long a person should stay polite when somebody keeps trying to take what matters most.